Morning, everybody. Welcome to Breakout Session 2 here at Cloud Summit 2021. A couple of speakers coming up at 11 o'clock and 11:30. In a moment, I'm going to be handing you over to John Gasparini from Bright Solid. And at 11:30, we're delighted to welcome back the very enigmatic Andy Hardy from Nasuni, who's going to be taking us through a file storage discussion at 11:30. So on with the first speaker. Before we do bring John up onto the screen, don't forget, today is just about consuming these wonderful talks. It's also about visiting our exhibition stands. Have a look at those stands, because not only do they obviously have very, very relevant products and services that you may have a requirement for or be interested in, but also they're incentivizing your visit with some rather amazing prizes, from Amazon vouchers, speakers, headphones. I think there's a Lego Technic set as well, which I think will probably be the most popular prize today. But do go around and, more importantly, use the chat facility to re-engage with people that you may have missed over this very, very challenging period. On to the first speaker. Delighted to welcome John Gasparini from Bright Solid. Bright Solid have been working with us since 2014, and delighted to welcome them back to this event. John spent the last 8 years helping organizations across the world basically successfully adopt public cloud services. Based on his experience, over the next 30 minutes, John's going to share insight into three key factors that you must include at the outset of your cloud adoption program to succeed. John, over to you.
Brilliant, Ray. Thank you very much for that great introduction. So let's get started. I want to start by just talking about the journey. I think, most organizations, I guess, aspire to kind of go on and then kind of start to overlay some of the factors that can kind of knock you off course. So at the beginning of a cloud adoption journey, there's typically a set of drivers that will be focusing the organization around some use cases for public cloud. I've got 4 examples on this slide. I recognize there are a range of other drivers as well that can influence the scope and outcomes of a cloud adoption journey. Right at the beginning, when the program's launched and there's communication around that within the organization, there's a massive amount of expectation, whether it's from the business around capability that they're going to be able to tap into to develop new products and services. But also within the IT organization, there's new technology they're going to be able to get their hands on. There's new skills that they're going to be able to develop. So that kind of, huge amount of initial expectation and excitement. And then initially, there'll be some early use cases and typically proof of concepts that an organization will embark on. And those proof of concepts will help maybe validate some of the big assumptions that underpin perhaps the business case and some of the justification for mobilizing that cloud program. And then, through that success, the organization, foot to the floor, will start delivering, hard to provide the outcomes and objectives of the cloud adoption program. And I guess ultimately, if you keep on the happy path, you kind of realize that potential and you've delivered on that business case. However, most organizations, it's not that plain sailing. And in my experience over the last 8 years, there are typically 3 factors that can knock a cloud adoption program off course. The first of those is around financial management. So poor financial management and lack of optimization. Again, failure to recognize some of the complexity that comes with that shift from a CapEx-based model to a variable OpEx-based model for your cloud resource, the ability to manage complex cloud provider bills, spend gets out of control, the budget holder suffers from bill shock. There's also a lack of capability to optimize the use of cloud resources and take advantage of the various commercial levers that the cloud provider offers to allow you to kind of reduce your spend on a regular basis. The second one's around weak security and compliance to standards. The cloud providers offer incredibly powerful platforms that in the right hands, you can achieve some great outcomes. However, in experienced hands, it's very, very easy to kind of poorly configure these resources, and that can result in data breaches and system compromises. It's also very difficult at the outset to be able to evidence or justify to security or internal audit or risk stakeholders how the cloud services you're going to build align with internal policies and controls or external regulations or industry standards, depending on what your business requires day-to-day to operate. And then the final one is around access to skills, and perhaps the hardest of the 3 to crack. We're operating in a market today where the available cloud expertise is not significant enough to kind of keep up with demand. Demand is outstripping supply. It's very, very difficult to tap into the skill you need on a timely basis. It's also incredibly hard once you've sourced that skill to retain that within your organization. Good cloud individuals are being tapped up on a regular basis by recruitment agencies or your nearest competitor. Failure to tackle these three things at the outset of a cloud program, in my experience, ultimately results in a reduction in scope. The likely scenario is your cloud journey will be a fraught journey. It will take longer than you anticipated, and you're going to hit a number of hurdles along the way. It could be challenges around spend, getting out of control, and difficult conversations with senior stakeholders around how you're going to wrestle control of that and how you're going to bring spend back within budget. If you're unable to tap into this expertise that you need, unfortunately, you might make mistakes along the way that perhaps cost you down the line and result in rework to kind of bring that back on track. Or you get a lot of challenge for internal security teams or risk teams. And again, the time and effort spent on that, or when you come to deliver outcomes at the end of the project and penetration tests uncover, again, a number of deficiencies, which again, you need to look at refactoring. Unfortunately, in that scenario, you kind of miss out on a lot of the potential you were looking to achieve when you set out on the journey at the outset. Worst case is cloud repatriation. The organization wants to bring it all back and continue to operate in a traditional model. And I've seen this nearly happen, and I've been fortunate where through my team we've been able to intervene to stop it from happening. My team was working with the CIO of a global publishing business, and they were spending a large amount of money. It was $25 million a year with one of the large public cloud providers. They had no financial management and obviously a lack of skill and expertise to exploit the optimization levers. And the CIO was about to bring it all back on-prem. But through the team, we were able to provide the insight he required. He started to understand what was driving his growth. We were able to take advantage of the optimization levers, bring that under control, and actually get him to a point where he was comfortable to proceed and allowed him to continue with his cloud adoption plans. The other outcome is the business get frustrated and they lose faith in the ability of the cloud adoption program to deliver what they need. And that just results in shadow IT. They go off and try and deliver the capability they need themselves. And it's interesting, when I go in and have a chat to organizations around financial management and they share with me the cloud provider bill, one of the questions I ask with them is, have you checked the expense system? Because you'd be surprised how many times I've come across organizations that are using corporate credit cards to cover the cost of cloud resources where the business are off doing something under the radar of the technology organization. But you can tackle these challenges head on and at the outset of the program, and by doing so, you can ensure your organization stays on the happy path. And I'm going to go through each of these three challenges and how you can do that in a little bit more detail. So if we start with financial management, cloud financial management requires 6 capabilities to exist for you to be successful. The first of those is around billing management, and you shouldn't underestimate the complexity involved in cloud provider billing. To give you a feel for this, in an organization I was working for recently, my monthly cloud provider bill was $500,000. The line items on the bill each month were in excess of 4 million. So 4 million cost line items in my bill. You're not going to process that in a spreadsheet. It's too big and it's too complex. The thing that you need to do is, across these 4 million line items, you need to allocate those resource and costs, typically to cost centers, and there may be credits associated with those resources as well that you need to factor in. And you need to align those costs, again, with purchase orders, typically in a large organization, and provide the right data points to the finance organization so they can process that through the finance system, attribute costs accordingly, and ultimately pay the bill with the cloud provider at the end of that month. As the budget holder, you're going to want regular insight and reporting that shows that you're in control of the spend and you are aligned with your overall budget for that period. You want a breakdown in consumption. You want to understand the trends around what's driving growth, which parts of the organization, which workloads. But you'll also want to share some of that insight, because what I've seen in particularly larger enterprises, while the budget holder may sit within IT, the individuals in the organization that are driving the consumption of cloud resources and the cost being picked up by the budget holder typically sit and can sit outside the IT function. It could be the chief data officer's organization that's driving a lot of that spend through a large data analytics, big data type project. So again, you'll want to share that insight and start to make others accountable for the spend, even down to the developer. And so they understand the actions they're taking and how that reflects in the cost the organization is having to incur as a result. Alert and respond, again, as the budget holder, the last thing you want to find out when the monthly bill lands is that you've overshot your budget significantly. You want to avoid that bill shock. And again, you can look to implement alerts, and they can be very basic alerts. Alert me when I've hit 80% of my budget this month. And that's fine if you get the alert on the 28th day of the month, because you should be comfortably within budget. But if you get that alert on the 15th of the month and you spend £80,000 of your £100,000 budget, you're going to struggle to recover that. You're going to overshoot. So again, you can look at anomaly-based detection and alerts, and through that, you can identify trends a lot earlier in the month. Perhaps on day 5, you can identify an anomalous behaviour around the consumption of a resource or a particular spend profile, which gives you a much greater chance to act early, recover that situation, and hopefully deliver to your budget on that period. The next capabilities around optimization, you've got resource optimization and financial optimization. And don't underestimate the complexity of these activities. To do optimization, you need to consume a large amount of billing data. I've talked about 4 million line items on a $500,000 bill. And you need to smash that together with resource utilization data, so CPU utilization, memory utilization, storage utilization. And then you need to overlay that with a level of business context. Because you're going to be making longer-term commitments around resource, you want to make sure that that resource is going to exist for that period of time, or it could end up incurring more cost over time. So through resource optimization, it's making sure that the capacity you have today is the capacity you need. You're not looking to over-provision. You only want to right-size and only have what you need. And again, through financial optimization, there are a range of levers. These levers can allow you to make commitments. In return for commitments, you can get discounts. These discounts can be within the region of 30 to 50% based on my experience. But there are other techniques you can use, such as scheduling of resources. You don't need to have your resources running 24/7, particularly for development environments. Developers typically work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So again, by switching off these resources outside of their normal working hours, you can save significant costs. And you might be able to apply scheduling to some of your line of business systems, particularly that are maybe only used during core business hours. The final capability is around governance and compliance. One of the things that I encourage organizations to do at the outset is to develop a tagging policy. So tagging is metadata that you can align to the cloud resources that you are provisioning. And that metadata can then be used to support the billing management process. So for example, through metadata, you can identify the owner of the resource, and every resource should have an owner. You can also tag the resource with the cost center, which makes billing management a little bit easier. So again, through governance and compliance, you want to make sure that every resource that you are running complies with your tagging policy. But again, you also want to make sure that you're continuing to manage your spend within budget, and you're using the governance and compliance process to assess the optimization opportunities that exist in your environment, agree which activities you're going to execute upon, and then look to measure the return that these activities are expected to generate. My guidance is you want to seek early help. You want to embed financial management at the outset of your cloud adoption program. In my experience, organizations that do this typically save at least 30% on their cloud bills. And as a budget holder, you will hopefully avoid bill shock as well. So you want to try and claw as much of that money back from the cloud provider through the term of the relationship. There's a couple of things you can do to help. The first of those is go and speak to your cloud provider, particularly if you've got an enterprise agreement. The cloud provider can provide a level of insight and help. They can help with some of the alerting that I talked about earlier. They can also provide a level of insight around resource optimization and financial optimization that will help. They will not build these 6 capabilities, and they will not run these 6 capabilities for you. What I do tend to recommend to most organizations, particularly at the outset, is to engage a specialist cloud partners. There are cloud partners out there like Brightsolid that can provide financial management and optimization as an ongoing service. The reason I say that is that one of the other challenges I talked about at the beginning was access to skill and resource. That's going to be really, really hard. And the skill and resource that you manage to secure, you want that resource focused on delivering the business outcomes associated with your cloud adoption program. The last thing you want is that scarce resource tied up managing your bill and running an optimization program. So certainly at the outset, look to engage a partner. Over time, you can look to repatriate that and bring it in-house once you've established the capability that you need. So that's financial management. If we move on to security and compliance, unfortunately, recent time is littered with organizations that have poorly configured their public cloud resources, and that's led to the exploitation of systems and data, resulted in data breaches. It doesn't matter the size and nature of the organization. Some of the largest, most mature organizations, as you can see on the slide, have got it wrong. And it doesn't matter which cloud platform you're using. Again, if you can poorly configure the resources, unfortunately, data and systems will be compromised. But there are easy things that you can do to help reduce risk of this occurring. So the first thing you need to be aware of is the cloud providers operate a shared responsibility model. And as the customer, it is your responsibility to ensure that the security and compliance configuration of your cloud resources is designed in a way to protect your system and data. It's not the cloud provider's responsibility, it's your responsibility. But the cloud providers do provide a range of services and features that you can use to help. For example, they can help you encrypt all of your data at rest. So it means if data was compromised, it's gobbledygook. No one can read it. They have a very sophisticated identity and access management services. So again, you can, through fine-grained access controls, limit who can access what at particular points in time. As I've said, cloud provider platforms in the right hands are incredibly powerful. In inexperienced hands, it is really, really easy to get it wrong, as you've seen on the previous slide. And that could end up with your systems and data being compromised. But you can get it right. And my recommendation is that organizations at the outset of the cloud adoption journey need to establish what I call a cloud control framework, comprising of a set of key technical and non-technical controls. Examples of those I've given on the slide here, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is an example of some of the things that you need to think about. When you look at non-technical controls, you've got things like contract management. You might think that's an obvious one. I signed up to terms and conditions when I agree to use a particular cloud provider. But depending on the nature of your business, there may be specific addendums you need to that contract to meet your business requirements. So for example, it might be a data processing addendum to meet specific data protection requirements, maybe in line with GDPR. If you are a financial services organization, the cloud providers offer a financial services addendum that helps you comply with the Financial Conduct Authority's cloud outsourcing guidelines. You've also got a set of technical controls. So examples of those highlighted in yellow, things like data security. So again, ensuring that all of your data is encrypted at rest, and you've got good control around the use of encryption keys, and particularly you're preventing the deletion of encryption keys. Delete the encryption key, you've lost your data. You want to try and avoid that at all cost. The controls that you implement, and particularly the technical controls, ideally should be preventative. And by preventative, I mean it stops your cloud developer engineer doing something that would not comply with that control. Where you can't do that, you can also implement detective controls, and that the detective control would detect that a developer and engineer has done something that doesn't comply with a control. It would alert the right group of people, and those individuals would then come along and assess what's happened and work to take any necessary steps to kind of bring that back into compliance. One of the things I would always recommend is you need to embed this at the outset of a cloud adoption program. It's incredibly difficult to retrofit a cloud control framework to an existing cloud environment. And again, I've seen that firsthand with an organization I was working with recently, where retrofitting the framework would in effect break the majority of the service that they'd built over a previous period. And what was required was a level of rework to bring those resources into compliance. So again, additional activity and additional cost to allow that organization to meet its security and compliance and regulatory requirements. When you apply the control framework as well, it's not about just applying it to production. You need to apply it from development through your whole route to live to production. You want your developers and engineers developing in a framework where the controls exist, rather than finding out in production when they go to deliver new services that they breach those controls and they're facing into a significant amount of rework. So again, embed the control framework through the route to live. Once you've identified developed your framework and identified those technical controls, you can implement those technical controls through what I call guardrails. And the guardrails are designed to provide a framework in which developers and engineers can develop innovative services without unnecessary friction. So it's about striking that right balance between protecting systems and data, but allowing engineers and developers to innovate and develop at pace. And if I use the analogy of the bridge in this slide, just quickly as an example, when the architects and engineers designed this bridge to take you across the river, they went with a straight path, a really easy path, most efficient route from one side to the other. But they put these railings or guardrails at the side of the bridge, and that was to stop you falling off and injuring yourself as you were getting from one side to the other. And the same holds true when it comes to public cloud. And to bring that to life, if I start with a control statement. So the control statement here, and again, this is from our control framework, is the ability to encrypt all data at rest, must be available, used at all times, and there's an encryption key management policy that must be defined and enforced across all cloud platforms. So that's my control statement. I need to ensure that everything I'm running, all of that data is encrypted at rest. My approach to guardrails includes 3 key components. The first one, and I mentioned earlier, that the cloud providers provide a set of services that I can take advantage of to help me implement those controls. So in this example, I'm going to use the key management service from the cloud provider, and that allows me to create an encryption key that I can use to encrypt and decrypt data. And I can also set that key to rotate on a regular basis. So just like I would want to rotate a password, I want to rotate the encryption key. Through the identity and access management service, I can define policies that allow me to control who or what resources can use that key to encrypt data and, most importantly, decrypt data. And also I can use those policies to prevent the deletion of the key, because if you delete the key, you lose the data. The second pillar that I would introduce is around giving my developers an infrastructure as a code pattern. So I want to make it really easy for them to do the right thing. So this code pattern, and say in this example, will allow the developer or engineer to launch a virtual machine with all of the storage for that virtual machine encrypted at rest. If I just stop here, I'm relying on trust. I'm relying on the developers and engineers using the code pattern that I've given them. But when developers and engineers hit a new use case, they'll jump onto Google and they'll do a search, because 9 times out of 10, someone else has solved that problem before. They find someone that has, and lo and behold, there's a code artifact they can take and they can look to embed in their overall code base that they're building to deliver this new product and service. Unfortunately, that artifact they've probably taken doesn't embed the controls that you're looking for. The net result here would be a developer or engineer launching something that's not compliant. And this brings me to the third pillar. So I'd also look to introduce a cloud compliance engine. And that compliance engine contains a set of rules. So in this example, when the developer looks to launch the virtual machine on a near real-time basis, the compliance engine detects that, it evaluates that virtual machine as it's being launched, identifies that the storage isn't encrypted, and it will automatically terminate that virtual machine, will notify the developer of their error. The developer can then go and fix their code and hopefully run that through successfully second time around. The other advantage of this approach is when it comes to security and compliance, I can now provide a near real-time view of my compliance position to controls and policies to my security colleagues and my audit team. So they can self-serve and get that real-time view, gives them the confidence that we're doing the right thing when it comes to cloud adoption. The final advantage of, again, taking an approach based on a control framework and a set of guardrails is it makes it really, really easy to show how you're complying with industry standards and external regulations. Again, this is an example from our control framework. Control area is data security. The control description mirrors what we used in the last slide around encrypting all data at rest. The risk I'm mitigating. So again, I'm trying to prevent unauthorized access, modification, and exfiltration of information. The technical guardrails that I'm using, you see the infrastructure as code pattern. Our Cloud Foundations product includes our Cloud Compliance Engine. And then you can see how that aligns to the various annexes within ISO 27001, National Cyber Security Centre's Cloud Security Principles, and so on. And then finally, around access to skills. At the outset of the program, you need to recognize that accessing the skill that you need and the time that you need it, and then retaining that skill is going to be incredibly hard. Again, there's just not enough supply of experience in the market to satisfy demand. What I would recommend is you do need to try and source at least a small number of experienced cloud expert professionals at the outset. You can look to do that through recruitment, either temporary or permanent recruitment, or via a specialist partner. If you are going to look to go and recruit, a word of warning, again, from my own recent experience, it took me 9 months to find a principal cloud engineer that brought the right skill and experience that we were looking for. So from advertising the role to them starting with Bright Solid, that was a 9-month period, significant lead time to find good cloud skills in the market. So perhaps you want, again, to look to a specialist partner to secure that early skill to get you going, and perhaps over time you look to kind of transition that to other resource that you manage to source. In addition, some of the best people already work for your organization, and they have great knowledge of your existing IT systems and services, and they'll typically have great relationships with key business stakeholders. So you want to invest in an internal training program to help develop the skills and expertise you need to support the target environment that you're looking to deliver. When it comes to IT, it's not just about skills around the target cloud platform you're building. You need to recognize that your IT resource need to operate more like developers going forward. They're going to be writing source code. They need to be familiar with source code management tools, continuous integration tools to support the automation you will use to build out cloud resources and cloud services in the future. But it's not just IT. There are skills and knowledge required across different parts of the business. We talked about financial management. Your finance teams need a level of knowledge around cloud. Security teams, internal audit teams, perhaps procurement as well. So there are stakeholders across the organisation that will need varying levels of knowledge and expertise around cloud to be successful and to allow you to realise the potential from your cloud adoption programme. And then finally, retaining skill, probably the hardest element here, with demand outstripping supply, keeping the skill that you've managed to source, or keeping the skill that you've invested in retraining is going to be incredibly important, and you're going to have to work incredibly hard at that. There are things that you can do. Again, it comes down to culture of the organisation, the people that you're working with, the nature of the work that you're doing, and it's not about just providing beer fridges and foosball tables forever we get back into working in an office again. There are other things you can do, things like hackathons that you can run on a regular basis, again, just to mix things up and keep things interesting. But again, there's no silver bullet, there's no easy solution, but I'd recommend you get that early expert help. You're going to be making some pretty fundamental decisions at the outset. You want to get that right. You want to make sure you don't regret it later. So get that early expert help. So that kind of brings me to the end of the session. So again, I guess if I look at the key takeaways from this morning, when you're embarking on a program and you want to realize your potential, there are 3 things that you must do to kind of stay on course and deliver success. The first one of those is around financial management. Again, ensure that you understand the spend, you understand what's driving that spend, and you are taking advantage of the levers that are available to you to reduce that spend over time and avoid bill shock. Again, my recommendation would be look to engage a specialist partner at the outset. Don't tie that scarce resource you've managed to source in managing the bill and managing optimization. Get them focused on delivering business value and the business outcomes. Again, from security and compliance, work on developing that cloud control framework at the outset and develop the right set of technical guardrails that helps you implement that framework, ideally through a set of preventative controls. And give you that kind of near real-time view on compliance, and do that at the outset and apply that across the full route to live. And then access the skills. Again, get early expert help. It will save you a lot of pain and heartache in the long term. You may need to source that from a specialist partner to begin with, because again, there are long lead times when you look at recruitment. When it comes to reskilling, recognise you're targeting both IT and the business. Recognise that your future IT capability needs to operate more like developers as well as administrators. And then recognise that you're going to have to work incredibly hard to retain that talent within your organisation. That brings me to the end of my slot this morning. I'd like to thank you all for listening. I hope you found that informative. I am going to be on the Bright Solid booth for the next hour. So if you do have any questions related to anything I've covered this morning, want to talk about cloud adoption more generally, tap into some of the insight that I've picked up over the last 8 years, then look, please join me on the booth. Happy to kind of catch up separately there. And again, thank you very much for listening.
John, thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation. And another good reason to visit the Bright Solid stand is they are actually raffling £250 worth of Amazon vouchers. And I think we can all safely say we've been living on Amazon for the past sort of 16, 17 months. You've been living off Amazon Web Services, John, and we've been living off Amazon.com. And another quick question for you, John, before I hand over to Andy, is do you have a beer fridge and a football table at Bright Solid?
No, we don't. But I have worked for organisations where we have had a beer fridge and a table. So, yes, I have been there in the past. But yeah, these are sometimes gimmicks, but they are nice.
Super. Yeah. And folks, again, if you do want to talk directly to John, he is on the Bright Solid stand. Go over there, just go onto the chat function on the stand, and John will either spin you up into a private chat or chat you openly on their open chat facility. John, thank you very much indeed. Next speaker up is nobody who's a stranger to Digit. This is possibly your 10th time speaking for us, Andy. Yeah, a bit of a veteran now. Andy Hardy is VP of Nasuni, one of the leading cloud file storage companies on the planet as it currently stands. He's going to be talking here today about some very stupid things that happen with the cloud. And the good thing is we like these warts and all presentations, Andy. Andy's going to be covering this for the next 30 minutes or so. I think, in fact, what we'll probably be doing is sticking some questions in at the end as well, Andy. I think there's some questions already coming through. So over to you, and we'll see you in 25 minutes. Thank you.
All righty. Okay, thanks. So beer fridges and foosball tables. I mean, we're all working from home now. And I don't know, I got a place for a cup of tea here. Maybe I should bring a beer fridge into the home office. All right, well, good morning anyway. So I'm Andy, and as Ray says, I'm Vice President for EMEA and APJ here at Nasuni. Look, I've been involved in storage, buying storage, investing in storage companies, selling storage solutions for the last 25 years. And I'm pretty passionate about this. I think there's some pretty stupid things about the way enterprises have to store or have had to store and protect unstructured file data today. And I also think that a hybrid cloud solution can save us from some of these stupid things by enabling us to consolidate traditional on-prem infrastructure into the cloud. I mean, I think very often a lot of these conferences, we think about cloud as primarily about DevOps and applications and so forth. But I believe we can have a big impact on on-prem infrastructure by moving to the cloud. And I think there's some really big reasons to do that. And for me, those big reasons are these stupid things. So here's what we think are some of the most stupid things about the way we've had to manage file storage in the last several decades. I'd be interested to know if any of you guys agree or have a different view. So let's start with running out of disk space. For many of us, this has been the only way to manage file storage, which is, by the way, unstructured file data is the majority, typically 80-90% of all the data capacity that you'll store in a business, because that's been done with fixed finite capacity per location. And in businesses that I've run, it was always really hard for us in the IT infrastructure team to predict where and when the business would need more capacity, whether more in Paris next year, more in Sydney, or more in London. And so we've had these silos that we've built, each with these fixed capacities based on our best guess, quite honestly, as to what the business is going to need. And happily, there are now in 2021 better options thanks to the cloud. And then there's backup. Well, it's often not just a single backup copy. We make copy after copy after copy of the stuff that the business has stored because we don't want to get in trouble for having lost it. And people tend to want multiple copies, dailies, weeklies, monthlies, and so on. Plus, of course, off-site copies, maybe on some old version of LTO tape that maybe you can't even restore from anymore, which leads us nicely to what I regard as the Achilles heel of backup, recovery, and archive, which has always been the restore process. Horror stories abound of images taking days to rebuild and recover from cloud or from other backup media. For one of our customers, for example, I'll speak a bit more about them later, Pernod Ricard. Some of you might know them. They make alcohol. It took them 3 business days to rebuild their NetApp filers after an outage. Now, the fact that those backup images were in the cloud was neither here nor there. It just takes time to move data back, to physically rebuild it before you can give access to staff. And of course, an outage of a few business days, well, the business didn't really like that. So when thinking about how we protect data, think more about how we recover data. How long does that take? What is the SLA? And how could that be less stupid? And then, of course, complexity. Now, we put together these complex stacks of primary storage, secondary storage, different silos, different locations. And the luxury of dedicated backup admins and storage admins might not be practical for everyone. And IT these days requires everyone to manage more and to be able to do so remotely. Having to integrate primary NAS, secondary backup, DR, robo, WAN infrastructure creates a hugely complex and expensive infrastructure that is quite challenging and expensive to manage. And then lastly, of course, and for me, the big elephant in the room is all of this costs way more than it should. It's not just about cost, it's also about the time it takes. You may not have time to manage it all. That can leave the business at risk. What if you haven't tested your backups are working? and your recovery processes, only to find out that they're not up to it after you've had that ransomware attack, and everyone's looking at you and asking, well, how long is this going to take to get back, Andy? And are we going to have to pay the ransom? We know that people do that all day, every day. And this is despite the huge investment in business as usual that we've got with our traditional on-prem backup and primary file storage infrastructures, NAS infrastructures. I'm talking about NetApp, Isilon, Commvault, all of that stuff. So why have things become like this? Well, more than anything, we think that enterprise file storage has simply become too complex and therefore way more expensive than it needs to be. And this is actually inherent in the legacy global file storage architecture that's typically seen in enterprise environments. Now, here's a typical example. Your business might be something like this. You'll typically have primary storage from the usual suspects. You might have Windows file servers or NetApps or, I don't know, QNAPs or Synology in some of your robo sites. You might have big old Dell Isilon filers in some of your larger locations. And each one of those is finite in capacity, needs managing across a life cycle. Will not only need shelves adding at some point, that or you've just bought too much empty space to start with, we'll have an end of life process and then another big RFP to replace it all. And mirroring that, there'll be secondary storage infrastructure for the purpose of making backup copies of that file data. And each of those will also be licensed according to how much stuff you've got. And of course, storage always grows. It grows quite rapidly, in fact, as we move to higher and higher res images and videos and all the rest of it. So this whole complex stack just keeps getting bigger, more constrained, more complex, and more expensive. And then, of course, you'll have a mini-me version of this in your remote offices, your branch offices, various silos, plus offsite DR and offsite backup and archive copies, all tied together probably with some expensive old WAN infrastructure. And this can all add up to a mighty complex environment, mighty expensive environment. So does your environment look something like this? We don't think that's because you're stupid. We think that that's just what's been possible inherently with this legacy infrastructure approach. And I wonder if this resonates with any of you. Be interested to hear from you at the end. So there is an alternative approach, and that approach leverages what I think is the most important change in the storage market in the last 25 years that I've been involved, and that's the rise and now domination of object storage. I'm talking about Amazon AWS S3 or Microsoft Azure Blob or Google GCP's equivalent Google Cloud Storage. These are all examples of object storage, which is incredibly low cost. You could use the word cheap. It's incredibly robust. You can get like 16 nines of durability and availability from that type of storage, and it's infinitely scalable, on demand. You only pay for what you use, and it can be available practically anywhere on Earth. So what we're able to do is take that technology and do two things. One is to build a file system on top of that, and that's really what Nasuni has done. We call that UniFS. It's a multi-cloud object storage-based file system, which inherits the properties of that underlying object storage. And we combine that with another element of our technology, which is edge compute technology, which is to do with an intelligent caching algorithm, which enables us to decouple where the data is stored from how the data is accessed, where the performance needs to be delivered, if you like. So this approach means that we can work with all those hyperscalers, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, to leverage that low-cost, robust object storage and massively reduce the cost of primary file storage, but without the need for separate backup and DR. And that's because within a cloud-based file system, I'm not constrained by the size of the box or the number of connectors on the back of it into which I can stick shelves, which means that, for example, I don't have a limit on the number of snapshots. So in a cloud-based file system such as Nasuni, leveraging that underlying object storage, we're able to have an infinite number of recovery points that we can recover from practically instantaneously within a matter of minutes, and very, very rapid, not only lower cost, but rapid recovery processes to go with it, fully integrated in that same file system. That's why we call it UniFS, that sort of unifying primary and secondary storage in the same file system. So this lets us combine primary, backup, DR as well, and the ability to share files between locations. I might have one of these edge appliances in Sydney, where I'm from. I might have another one in London, where I live. And if I change something in Sydney, we can transmit the deltas to be synchronized between those edge appliances really quite rapidly, which means that businesses can collaborate far more readily than they would otherwise be able to do. So in the next few slides, I'll take you through how this type of cloud file storage architecture would impact those 5 things that I've identified as being kind of stupid around the historical on-prem model. That would be the capacity, the complexity, backup, restore, and most importantly, cost. So let's look at the capacity issue first. I mean, historically, we'd always run out of something, whether it was file storage terabyte capacity or snapshot reserve space or some other overheads, or perhaps the number of users that I could put in a location or the number of locations themselves. There'd always be some constraint born of that finite siloed on-prem infrastructure that I had to ship in exchange for capital expense into each of those locations. And by moving to a cloud-based file system such as UniFS, we're able to have no limits on things that are otherwise inherently limited in that hardware-based architecture. And by the way, a lot of existing hardware-based architectures have been what we call lifted and shifted into the cloud, just simply put into someone else's racks. That means you would import those same constraints into the cloud. So more on that in a moment. But if you want to have an unlimited amount of capacity that you can expand on demand, which means therefore you just don't buy more of it than you need, an infinite number of recovery points that cost you nothing extra, and an infinite number of places where you can access this data with any number of users while only paying per terabyte for the storage itself, then this is a far superior type of approach. When I was running IT for one of the global banks in London back in the 90s, I was one of NetApp's early customers, and we had infrastructure in Paris and infrastructure in London and infrastructure in Luxembourg, for example. I had a project in Paris that didn't grow anything like the business said it would, and I had another project in Luxembourg that took off. I couldn't just use the empty capacity in Paris to solve the problem in Luxembourg, whereas in the cloud, I have that flexibility, that agility. Let's turn now to complexity. Now, if I do take a legacy architecture and move it into the cloud, it's going to stay complex. So let me give you an example of one of those legacy architectures, NetApp's Cloud Volumes on Tap, for example. It basically takes what was built in the old world and lets you run it in the cloud. Now, the problem with this is that both the limitations, volume size limits, limited number of snapshots, the sort of stuff I was talking about on the previous slide, and the complexity, the need to integrate multiple parts of their stack, of their set of products in order to bring that together. It'll still need backup. It'll still need DR. It'll still need separate instances in each of those locations. Well, if I compare that to a solution which has all of that integrated, obviously there's a lot more complexity in that. We would require just a single console to deliver the global namespace, the unified and fully integrated primary backup and DR. And we think that is one of the wins that you want by moving to the cloud, because it is stupid to keep that level of complexity. So if you don't require a separate copy of your file data for backup and DR purposes, instead, what we're able to do is leverage that infinite and low-cost capacity of object storage, which is, don't forget, itself globally replicated, highly durable, erasure-coded around multiple racks in multiple data centers, and if you want to pay for it in multiple geographies with 11 or 16 nines, whatever you want to pay for on the low-cost object storage of durability. Well, if that's what's underlying the file system, and it lets you have an infinite number of immediately available recovery points, then you can sort of think of that as infinite snapshots built in at no extra cost. So when customers, and I'll give some examples in a minute, when customers move that and consolidate that legacy NAS, they simply don't have to bother about the separate secondary storage copies because we can combine that all in one go. And customers will also get better SLAs, like recovery points and recovery time objectives, RPOs and RTOs of just minutes, than they could typically achieve with that separate backup copy. That time it takes to move data from the secondary copy to the primary, to rebuild it all and then give users access, that's gone away. We can just move pointers within the file system to a snapshot image at any past point in time, and that's what the user will see henceforth. And this massively impacts ransomware mitigation. We can readily mitigate the impact of ransomware, for example, by rapidly recovering to a point in time just before the encryption event. And should you lose hardware at a given location, then users can also rapidly recover from that kind of physical disaster or physical outage by accessing their files within minutes without having to wait for a full rebuild. You can just redirect them to another one of these edge cache appliances, for example. So there are ways to address all of those operational issues, but what does it really cost? And I think cost savings is a huge issue today, simply because we've seen through the increase in global uncertainty, not just the pandemic, we've got very different geopolitical environment and less stable than we've seen in the last several decades. It means that all businesses are far less sure of their revenue path, their forward revenues, and also far less sure about where they're going to need supply, demand, where they're going to see business grow and shrink. So we expect customers to be able to typically halve the cost of their current file storage, backup, and DR by moving this type of infrastructure, consolidating it in a cloud-based file system. And this enables you to move your NetApp, Isilon, Windows file servers, other primary NAS workloads to the cloud and pay via an OpEx subscription model. We charge per usable terabyte per year on top of the object storage costs, which are really de minimis. And people will worry about things like egress charges, for example. That, again, is where this intelligent caching approach comes in. In the case of our customer base, we have about 150 petabytes under management today. 98% of the reads actually come from that local edge cache and don't involve egress of data from the cloud. So it's not just about the cost per terabyte, you'll all understand. You'll need someone to help you look carefully at the full cost of these things, but that is something that's taken into account here. And also no hidden extra costs, no charges per user or per site. And with that infinite recovery point built in, you'll also be able to do things like reduce soft costs around user productivity and recovery times. By the way, I think it's also important that you only pay for what you use. And in the traditional on-prem model, and cards on the table, I used to run storage sales for one of the world's largest on-prem storage vendors here in Europe. That was Dell. All of those on-prem systems that we used to sell, well, they would require that the customer set aside big chunks of that actual physical capacity that they bought and use it for all kinds of overheads, empty space to grow into, RAID overheads, snapshot reserves. So the big difference in the cloud with the cloud model is if you need 300 terabytes, you pay for 300 terabytes of actual file storage, not for 500 terabytes of stuff in this rack that gets replicated to another 500 terabytes of stuff in another rack in another data center and gets backed up 500 terabytes of backup and all of that as well. So I think this is a very important difference to focus on when you go to the cloud. So I'll wrap it all up here. Basically, instead of that inflexible model that would always run out of disk space, require separate backups, secondary storage for your backup and DR copies, take considerable time to restore files. This was written by our wonderful marketing team at a time when the vaccinations hadn't rolled out so far as they have now in this country. So they quipped that it could be longer than the time it would take to get vaccinated. I think it's pretty quick to get vaccinated now, actually. But also with that complexity in that old stack of things you have to bolt together and therefore a lot of cost. Instead of that, you can now have systems that are without limit, can scale on demand, only pay for what you need, with that built-in backup and DR, the ability to recover, which is more important than anything else, within minutes, and a great simplicity that means that you just won't have to deal with that complexity of that existing environment, and which will cost you something like 50% less. So a couple of quick customer examples, so I finish in time for questions. If there are any, Ray, that you'd like to ask, I'm open to that. I need about 2 more minutes and I'll be done. So, for example, Ramboll. Now, I don't know if any of you know these guys, but you might know buildings like the Sydney Opera House, and you might know, for example, the bridge that connects Copenhagen and Malmo. Very famous TV show about that bridge. Well, these are the guys that do the engineering for those type of big structures. And they've got tens of thousands of employees across 35 countries. And in their case, we replaced several petabytes of NetApp at their headquarters. But also when, for example, Prime Minister Modi told the Indian workforce that they all had to go home, and that happened overnight, it was also possible for them now with a consolidated global file system to have people in Europe continue working on projects that their Indian workforce couldn't for a period of time get to and work on. And all of that's quite important in a global business with the degree of uncertainties that we see in the global environment today. Morten Madsen's quoted at the bottom there. He's saying that unlimited object-based storage, that's that S3 type stuff I was talking about before, in the cloud, gives them the flexibility of moving or deploying a new appliance within a very short time frame. And that became important to them during the recent pandemic, for example. Pernod Ricard, this is a European, French headquartered alcohol vendor. Some of you might have heard of Absolute Vodka, for example. That's just one of their many brands. They've got about 50 offices, and across Western Europe now, they've replaced all their on-prem, NetApp and Commvault or whatever it was that they were using with Nasuni. Holger Marx, who sits in Düsseldorf, manages that infrastructure for them in Western Europe. And he's quoted there as saying they just have less work to do now than they did on that traditional, in their case, Windows file system, in some areas, NetApp in others, based infrastructure. And then lastly, in the oil and gas industry, Ithaca, for example, Malcolm Brown up in Aberdeen, give them a call. They acquired the assets of Chevron in the North Sea, for example. That meant that they had to grow hugely, very rapidly. Rather than buying racks of equipment, they just poured more data into their global cloud file system. And Malcolm's quoted there as saying it's not only about cost, the technology's simplicity and ease of use and adaptability of the cloud-based architecture is really what made the big difference to them. So that's where I'll wrap up. I think I'm roughly on time there, Ray. Like I said, we've got about 150 petabytes of this under management, partnerships with Amazon, Microsoft, Google, etc. And we do this for all kinds of brands that you've probably heard of. Some of them on the screen there, like Adidas and Reed Elsevier. So thanks for listening. Hope you found that interesting, guys.
Andy, thank you very, very much indeed. Number 11, done, dusted. One question is, do you really mean to say there's no, I mean, everybody's been talking about DR and backup and the importance of backing up. No need for separate backup copies of enterprise file data with you?
Oh, yeah. Now, we're not saying it's not important to be able to recover. It's vitally important to be able to recover. We are saying that you don't need to make another whole copy, daily, weekly, monthly, full dump, another copy again in your DR infrastructure. We think that's wasteful. You don't need to be able to do that. Because that underlying S3 infrastructure is so robust, it gets erasure coded all over the planet, if you want to do it that way. It means it's not going to go away. You could lose Western Europe and you would still find your objects somewhere in a lot of scenarios. But what you need on top of that is the ability to go back to a past point in time. Now, the cloud type of storage makes it possible for us to do that. Historically, in a box, like a NetApp file or a Windows file server, there would be some table space, which is finite, which would physically let you address a number of snapshot copies. When I first started out in the 90s with this type of technology, I think you could go back to 4 or 8 snapshot copies. Well, that can be like 100 or more, hundreds today, but it's still quite finite, and you will overwrite them in a number of days. So if you want to go back beyond that, today you just have to have separate copies. So that's why people think that backup is the best practice. Well, because we don't have that type of limitation in a cloud-based file system, we can have an infinite number of those recovery points that we can rapidly go back to, and that's a very valuable thing.
And GDPR data privacy, it's top of the list, not just for the loss of data and the financial implications, but obviously the brand management and the reputational risk that data loss brings. To what extent can you build trust when it comes to people moving files into the cloud? Because everybody seems to think on-prem safe, off-prem not safe. How is that trust built?
I think people historically thought, well, if it's over there, it's out of my control. And John spoke about the importance of encryption at rest, for example. What I think is probably more important is, where does the encryption take place? And technologies like the one I just described pre-encrypt the data. That means that the customer's encryption keys, which are on their premises in their key safe, rather than the cloud vendor's keys are doing the encryption. And so if you've pre-encrypted the data, that's where the point of control is before it gets sent to the physical storage location in the cloud. That means that despite things like the USA Patriot Act, which say that a US headquartered company can and should give data to the US feds if they ask, well, they could only give it to them in its encrypted form if the encryption keys don't live with that data. So pre-encrypting the data does mean, whether it's going to your own data centers in another geography or whether it's going to a cloud vendor's data centers, that you can ensure that data privacy. And that's what GDPR requires you to do, to take responsibility for. And I think that is very important when we think about distributed global file systems. Yeah.
So I mean, I know that a number of European and in particular UK-based companies were very concerned about the Patriot Act and having, and I think correct me if I'm wrong, the Patriot Act also referred to if you stored your data in American data centers as well. I believe
worse than that, Ray. Worse than that. Not only in American data centers, in data centers that are owned and operated by an American corporation, is my understanding.
Right. So that concern that people had about having data stored in America or under the auspices of an American company don't have that concern because of the pre-encryption method, and wouldn't have to do that upheaval just to move it to an EU-based data center.
That's right. And let's bear in mind too, it's not just about American companies. Lots of my customers have to store some of their data in Alibaba in China because there are local pressures, sometimes rules that encourage you to store the data there. I have another customer, a major global oil company called BP, that has to store some of their data in Egypt, for example, because of Egyptian government rules. So there's all sorts of reasons why someone else might care where your data is. And maybe that's because they've got some obligation to be able to access that data. Well, if that's the case, and if you're constrained as a European company by the GDPR, you want to make damn sure that you've pre-encrypted that before it goes, whether to your own data center or to someone else's in that different geography, I would suggest.
Super. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the session, Andy. As ever, thank you very, very much indeed. I think you're interrupting a holiday, aren't you, to come and speak to us here today?
I'm here at the King's House in Wales. I got a view of Snowdon out the window, so
absolutely wonderful.
It's great to be here.
Always good to have you back, and thank you again for Nasuni's support. Andy Hardy from Nasuni. If you've got any questions for the Nasuni team, do head over to their stand. Ooh. They are the most generous raffle giver today as well.
Right,
£500, isn't it?
£500 up for grabs there. Yeah.
£500 raffle. That's normally it's 100 or 200, something like that. But Nasuni really pushed the boat out. £500. Go and have a look and see what that entails on the Nasuni stand. Andy Hardy, as ever, thank you, sir. All the best, folks. Over in the main room, starting in about 1 minute, we have got Mark Mitchell from Checkpoint. If you've not seen Mark speak before, I'd go and have a look. He's one of the best stories we ever have at Digit, and very enigmatic, and builds in a very, very good picture of what he's talking about. He's going to be talking about a vital component of cloud, which is obviously security and how you can secure your cloud. But from myself and the rest of the team, thanks for visiting us in session 2, and we look forward to seeing you after lunch.